Welcome to this special panel on German elections that is organized by the European Center for Populism Studies, ECPS, based in Brussels, relatively young venture. As part of ECPS' ongoing commitment to analyze the global rise of populism and authoritarianism, we often curate panels that explore the main trends in diverse political contexts. Our goal is always to foster a deeper understanding of the challenges posed by populist and authoritarian political movements worldwide. So today, we are convening a special session to examine the post-election Germany and where we stand in terms of democracy, populism, and the surge of far right. The panel will hopefully provide crucial insights into the political realignments in Germany and, of course, their broader implications for Europe and beyond. So I have the privilege of moderating this panel. I am Cengiz Aktar. I'm professor of political science presently at the University of Athens in Greece, and I'm a member of the advisory board of the ECPS. My research focuses on EU integration policies, the politics of memory concerning minorities, ethnic and religious, the history of political centralism, as well as international refugee law. So I'm a retired professor, but still active. I would like to inform the participants that in line with ECPS's dedication to knowledge dissemination, a detailed panel report will be written, and the video recording of this the discussion will be made available in our website and the YouTube channel. So these resources obviously serve as valuable references for scholars, students, policymakers, and the wider public seeking to understand contemporary threats to democracy. German elections. Well, they probably never made the news headlines around the world, or at least in Europe, as this year's race and consultations. I personally, as an interested but external watcher, have noticed two major tendencies. First, the irresistible rise of Alternative für Deutschland, and the gross interference in favor of AfD by American decision makers, be it elected or unelected. You know whom I'm talking about. Well, we will certainly see clearer to these tropisms thanks to our 5 speakers. So before giving the floor, I would like to remind that we will have a Q&A session, as always. After the completion of the presentations, the participants can write their questions in the chat box or by raising this virtual yellow hand and pose their questions in person. So we will start with Dr. Eric Langenbacher, who is a professor at Georgetown, Department of Government. His research focuses on political culture, collective memory, and German and European politics. His CV is of course much longer than that, but as you want to retain, I invite all those who are interested in Dr. Langenbacher to Google him, as well as the other panelists. I will keep it short so to give more time for the talks, and the day we are normally expecting our speakers to talk 15 minutes. Now, Eric, you have the floor.
Thanks so much. Let me share my screen, and let's see. All right, well, it's really a great honor to be invited to this panel today. There's a lot of intellectual firepower on the panel. So I'm going to start by just giving an overview and then a few insights, well, or thoughts, I guess. I'm not sure that we have insights at this point on what's going on with the transatlantic relationship. So first, we'll start with some results. So here are the 2025 results. And you can see in the lighter shade how the parties fared the last time around in 2021. The CSU won this election with 28.6% of the vote. I personally think that was a disappointing result because they were polling in the 30, at some points, 32% range. So I think they had a not as great night as they had expected. The AfD, of course, doubled its share of the vote from 2021, coming in just under 21% of the vote, followed by the SPD, the Greens, also the FDP. Those are the three parties of the so-called traffic light coalition that collapsed back in November. They all had a pretty bad night, although I would point out that the Greens didn't have that bad of a night compared to the SPD. And of course, the Liberals, the Free Democrats, who made it below the 5% threshold and will not be in the next parliament. The other party that had a really good night was the Left Party. You can see with nearly 9% of the vote, that was a very good result for them, especially given that 2 months ago, they were at 4% in the polls. So they had a late surge and did very, very well. All right, so in terms of the seats, I mean, obviously, Germany is a pretty proportional place. So the seats do correspond pretty nicely with the vote percentage. Not so great this time because so many votes were wasted on the FDP. Also, this new political grouping, the Alliance Langenbacher, which also barely missed the 5% threshold. If memory serves, they needed 13,000 votes. So you can see the seat totals there. There are only two possible minimum connected winning coalitions, which would be the CDU-CSU with the AfD, which is not going to happen, at least this time. And then with the CDU-CSU with the SPD, which is exactly what they are negotiating, I think, as we literally speak right now. Oh, okay. All right. But the big kind of cleavage in German politics is still the East-West cleavage. And you can see that extremely starkly with this map or with these graphs here. So we see the Eastern results on the left and the Western results on the right. And it's almost like two different countries, two different party systems. You can see that the AfD was the most popular party in the East at 32%, whereas in the West, it was the CDU-CSU at over 30% of the vote. What's also interesting is you can see that the leftist parties are not doing very well in the East. They're doing much better in the West. And in fact, the AfD did come in second, so to say, in the West, but almost tied with the SPD. So that's kind of interesting as well. We also have to, I think, look at how the vote shares break down by age group. You can see on the upper left, that is the AfD's share of the vote. You can see that they did best with middle-aged people, particularly middle-aged men. They did best in the 35 to 44 age group, followed by the 25 to 34 age group. If we look at older voters, right, 60 and older, you can see that it's like the old Federal Republic right there with the CDU, CSU, and the SPD doing much better than the other groups. And if we look at the under 25, so the kind of youngest voters, you can see that they actually liked the left party the best with 25% of the vote, followed by the AfD at 21%. And maybe that's something that we can talk about a little later on. I've been getting lots of questions about why the youth vote went the way that it did. This is very different from 2021, where the youth vote was won predominantly by the Greens and by the Liberals, the FDP. So that is definitely something to flag and to discuss a little later on. All right, where did the AfD votes come from? So what's interesting, and this is a pattern that goes back, I know that Hannah and others have thoughts on this as well, but actually it was non-voters, so people who didn't vote the last time in 2021, that they got the most voters from. So 1.8 million, you can see they got over 1 million from the union parties. They got 890,000 from the FDP, and then also 720,000 from the SPD, the Social Democrats. So that I think is kind of fascinating. The AfD obviously only lost a few votes, and interestingly to that alliance, Sarah Wagenknecht. I should, I guess, also point out that at, I think, 82.5%, the turnout rate was the highest that Germany's seen since 1987. So it was definitely a very salient, high interest election. All right, so a couple of my takeaways. We have to remember that the AfD has not normalized, or I mean, I should say it has normalized, but it hasn't de-radicalized. And I think that especially on foreign policy, the party's way outside of the mainstream consensus in terms of support for Russia, et cetera. And then, of course, they're also pretty hardcore when it comes to migration, although the other parties have started to adjust and move to the right when it comes to policy in that area. Again, it was the second most popular choice behind the left among young voters. And so that could be cause for concern. It's also true that with the left party, these two kind of like right-wing and left-wing extremist parties have a blocking minority in the Bundestag, which will make it very difficult to do anything that requires a supermajority, like amend the Constitution. So that's kind of a significant result. The East-West fissures are as strong as ever, and I think they're going to be very difficult to overcome, and nobody seems to have any real idea of what to do about political preferences, the grievances that still seem to characterize Eastern German politics. That being said, one of my takeaways from my time in Berlin, where I was on a study tour before the election and talked to an AfD functionary actually, is that I think they have a low ceiling, right? There are lots of surveys that show that big majorities of Germans would never vote for the AfD. So I think that is an important kind of constraining factor. The other thing too that became very evident is the fissures within the AfD, right? That the Western and the Eastern AfD are quite different. I think the Western AfD is obviously more pragmatic. I think they would be willing to compromise to go into a coalition government. I'm not so sure that the Eastern AfD is capable or willing to do something like that. So I don't know. I felt a little less concerned having been there. Now, shifting quickly to the transatlantic relationship, the unprecedented interventions by American actors were already kind of noted. Elon Musk, well, I mean, he's kind of American. He's also Canadian and South African. So whatever he is, right? He was extremely active, publishing an op-ed in a widely read newspaper, endorsing the AfD, doing an interview on X with one of the AfD's co-leaders and chancellor candidate, Alice Weidel. He also appeared in a rally. It was extremely Big Brother-esque, with this massive kind of image of Musk looming over this rally. We also know that Vice President J.D. Vance has intervened, perhaps a little bit more indirectly through the Munich Security Council speech, but then making a very pointed gesture by meeting with Weidel afterwards. That being said, from what I've seen, there's no evidence that American interventions, Musk in particular, affected the vote one way or the other. And one also has to, I guess, try to speculate as to why these kind of Republican or right-wing politicians in the United States are even bothering to intervene in the German case. I mean, I guess the most obvious explanation would be that there's ideological affinity, that there's similar foreign policy stances, especially towards Russia and Ukraine. But I don't know, one of the things that surprised me, if you look at the AfD's rhetoric, if you look at their political platform, they're not particularly supportive of the United States or America writ large. One politician said that Germany is America's vassal. Another said Germany is America's slave. And in their platform, they want to get rid of the stationing of long-range US weapon systems in Germany. So it's hard to understand. Perhaps it's possible that these Republicans haven't actually done any research or looked at the AfD's platform. But maybe there is. I mean, there's this whole debate here in Washington about whether Trump's playing four-dimensional chess, or I think now it's gone up to 5 or 6-dimensional chess or something like that. And it's possible that their strategy is to support parties that are Eurosceptics, right? If not deeply against the European Union, as a way to weaken the EU. One of the constants in Trump's rhetoric and his policy is a real animus towards the European Union. He's called it a foe. He said the European Union is out to screw us. I think he may have used more colorful, language as well. So maybe that is what's going on there, but who knows? We can only kind of speculate at this point. So in my opinion, right now, the German-American and the larger transatlantic relationship is broken. For me, the only question is whether it's irrevocably broken or whether that can be mended at one point in time. We should not forget the import of Friedrich Merz, the probable next chancellor, the import of what he said on election night, that Europe needs to become independent of the United States. I think that's really significant. Merz is one of the most transatlanticist politicians that you could imagine. In fact, he even ran the Atlantic Blocker, this very important kind of organization, for 10 years, if memory serves. So for somebody like him to go on record to say that, I think is hugely significant and really speaks to a real shift in the German stance and German policy. I think it's also probably as significant that one of the first things that Merz and his SPD counterpart, Lars Klingbeil, announced was massive new spending on infrastructure, on defense, and that there are actual discussions going on that Germany might have to look elsewhere for nuclear deterrence and nuclear guarantee, and elsewhere, of course, would be France and maybe the UK. Things are going to get worse before they get better, in all likelihood. There already are tariffs on steel and aluminum. We know that the EU has already responded. Trump has threatened even higher tariffs. So that's going to be an immediate challenge. And then I guess in the medium or the long term, there's a real worry that US troops will be pulled out of Germany and maybe Europe in general, and that NATO might actually be dissolved, or at least would continue to exist, but with the United States withdrawing from that organization. I know I don't want to be a scaremonger or anything like that, but I think that there is a distinct possibility that that could happen. All right, that's what I have to say. Thank you for listening.
Eric, you remain with us, or you want to leave early, or?
No, I'll remain with you.
Very well. Okay. The questions then at the end of the talks. Now I give the floor to Dr. Kai Arzheimer, who's a professor of German politics and political sociology at the University of Mainz. And he's particularly interested in European far-right parties and their votes. He will tell us how can we explain the rise of the AfD in the 2025 elections. Kai, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. What happened? What happened in Germany? We've seen a slide in Eric's talk about the AfD doubling its 2021 result. It went up from 10.4 to 20.8. But as Eric already mentioned, turnout was super high. And so if you look at the absolute numbers, it's actually much worse. They managed to increase the number of votes by 147%. It's quite an achievement, 5.5 million additional votes. And the question I'm trying to address is how is this possible? How did they manage to mobilize so many additional voters? And of course, all the explanations you have heard so far start with this map, which is really quite striking. It looks like we're still back in 1946 or so, Germany divided more or less in 4 zones. And of course, what really stands out is the former GDR in light blue. This map shows the strongest party in each of the 299 districts and the AfD result in the eastern states, with the exception of Berlin, which is sort of an honorary member of the Club of Western States. With the exception of Berlin, it's totally through the roof. So more than 30% in all eastern states, more than 37% in Saxony, Anhalt, and Thuringia. So here in the south of the former GDR, and up to 47% of the vote in their core strongholds in Saxony, where the party has become totally dominant, really domineering any sort of political discourse. But this map is still misleading for a number of reasons. And perhaps the most important of these reasons is quite obvious from the size of these districts. You can see that you have really large parts of land here, and that is because there is not much population living in the former GDR. They make up just 1/6 of the total electorate in Germany and are responsible for just about 1/4 of the total AfD vote. And that's actually down. It was 1/3 of the total AfD vote back in 21. And the reason behind this change is that the AfD massively managed to increase its vote in the West. Of course, coming from a much lower base, and it's not really visible in this map where you have very few of these light blue spots showing local AfD strongholds, but across the board, the AfD has become much, much stronger in the West than it used to be. And in 15 Western districts, you have AfD results which are above the average of Saxony in the 21 election. In some smaller places, you have AfD vote shares in excess of 30%. Even in the vicinity of Mainz, which is a left liberal hotspot, but if you take your car and drive 30 miles out of the city, you come to villages in the countryside where the AfD is really, really strong in the old Southwest. Where did those voters come from, and where did voters go in this election? You've already seen this graph here, which just goes to show that the AfD made significant inroads with younger voters. Although we're now talking about more or less average behavior amongst the youngest voters. But in the past, the AfD underperformed in that demographic. So this is an important change. You can see, especially with young men, they get 27% of the vote. So in terms of a gender gap in far-right voting, this is quite an interesting group, and we'll hear more about that later on. But overall, the gender gap has become smaller, which is an interesting development and points towards a kind of normalization of the AfD. So in 21, the AfD got 7.8% of the female vote, but 13% amongst male voters. Now it's 18 to 24. So the ratio has become more equalized. What else do we know about the AfD voters in this election? They have become even more working class, and they managed to mobilize 1.8 million former non-voters. Eric has also mentioned that they won from the Christian Democrats. They also won from the Liberal Democrats, which was a fatal blow to this party because they were never too strong to start with and lost almost 1 million of their 21 voters to the AfD, which is really disproportional. Also 0.7 million from the SPD, but perhaps the most remarkable point is this one. They lost hardly any of their 21 voters. They were super, super good at retaining the 21 vote and won an additional slice of the total electorate that was even bigger than their old. Why is that so? What drives the AfD vote? The most important issue for them is still immigration, specifically the rejection of Muslims, other culture war issues like gender, the green transformation, all that. But I think the most important issue is and remains immigration as being linked to terrorism, to an increase in crime, which is objectively not there. So crime numbers have come down. But in the public's eye, and especially in the way the AfD is framing what's going on in Germany, everything is becoming more terrible. Crime is way up, terrorism is rampant, and it's all the immigrants' fault. And that's still the main driver of the AfD vote. AfD voters are also economically anxious, predominantly working class, predominantly worrying very much about their economic outlook and the economic outlook of Germany more generally. And that, of course, connected to this campaign, which started out as a campaign dominated by the issue of Germany's economic slump in a very uncertain global environment. Taken together, this looks very much like what drove the AfD vote in the past, in 21 and in previous elections. But there is one additional point now, and this is, of course, Russia's renewed attack on Ukraine, which provided the party with a whole host of issues which are kind of secondary, but importantly compatible with their main narrative. So they're talking about the economy becoming much worse after Germany's involvement in that war, about Germany's energy security being undermined. You've already mentioned, Eric, NATO and their complex relationship with the Americans, their focus on peace. And that was really important for them from, I would say, 23 on. And for a time before the Wagenknecht alliance was formed, they almost had a monopoly, in a sense, on peace politics. The striking thing, really, to me, about the rise of the AfD is that the AfD is not moderating. On the contrary, it's becoming ever more radical. So whereas in our neighboring countries like in France or even Italy or Sweden, just about any other West European country, the radical right is trying to appear more moderate. It's ever more obvious that the AfD is really dominated by its most nationalist, I could say ultra-nationalist, I could say folkish, whatever you want to call them, factions. So these guys, which are particularly strong in the East, but have control over the party at large. They're really dominating what the party is doing and what they are standing for. Just to give you some ideas what I mean by radicalization. So the faction's leader been convicted twice for using Nazi slogans. Last time around, that was during the European parliamentary campaign. The outgoing AfD caucus in the Bundestag recruited more than 100 staffers from right-wing extremist organizations outside the party proper. So statistically speaking, every AfD MP employs 1.5 right-wing extremists. And this is not going to change in the new Bundestag. This will continue on a much higher level. At the rank and file level of the party, there's a lot of overlap with militias and other local right-wing groups. We have a whole host of mostly regional MPs that are involved with prepper chat groups, preparing for some revolutionary day when the current political order will break down. And we have a former national MP and a former judge to boot standing trial on terrorism charges. She was slated to be the justice minister in the upcoming revolutionary government. Perhaps the most important indicator of the way the party is going is this issue of remigration, a code word for expelling millions of Germans with a so-called migration background from Germany. That's an idea that's been floated by the right-wing extremist identitarian movement. And round about a year ago, people from the AfD met with Martin Sellner, and that was something that caused a huge outcry, not just in Germany, but also in Europe, cost them their membership in the ID group in the European Parliament. Just days before the election now, at the final party conference before the election, Alice Weidel, the Kanzlerkandidat, declared that this is now the party line. So a year ago, they really tried to put some distance between them and the identitarians, but that distance is gone now. It's official now. The AfD is the party of remigration, and nothing of that had any electoral cost for them. On the contrary, they managed to double or more than double, if you look at the absolute number of votes, their support in this election. How can we understand that? How can we try to explain that? I think one important part of the story is the increased salience of immigration as the most important political problem in Germany. So here we have a time series that goes back almost 25 years. It's from the Politbarometer survey, and you can see that immigration was briefly salient in the early 2010s. Then you have this massive boost here. That's, of course, the so-called asylum or migration crisis in Europe. And then quite interestingly, at the time of the 21 election, the salience of migration had come down. Policy preferences on migration did not really change during this period. We know that from the GLES studies, but the salience has come down. And that might explain why the AfD wasn't doing so well in 21. But then, of course, from 23, you see this new spike. It's still not the same level as during the so-called crisis, but it's higher than at most points in the last 25 years. And that really reflects the centrality of migration in political discourses in Germany. Of course, there were also some real-time, real-world events driving up these figures. There was a very long, very public conflict between the federal government, the state governments, and local governments about the funding for housing of Ukrainians fleeing to Germany. A very large number arrived in 2022 and 23. Housing them wasn't that expensive, so they were basically talking about millions of euros, which is a lot of money for me and you, but not for the federal government. I think it was totally unnecessary to let this conflict fester for so long. But that was probably not the main driver of this increased salience. What also contributed were the center-right parties, so the Christian Democrats, but also the FDP from inside the government copying the AfD's rhetoric and their talking points. And of course, events during the campaign. There was a series of car and other violent attacks on people in Germany, which were framed as something due to our lax asylum rules and requiring some pretty drastic changes, new harsh measures. Even the Greens came up with a 10-point plan for bringing down immigration. And if even the Greens do that, you realize how self-reinforcing this narrative has become. The crowning achievement here was, of course, the Christian Democrats with support from most of the FDP and some of the Sarah Wagenknecht MPs voting through a purely symbolic anti-immigration motion just days before the election with the support of the AfD. Without the support of the AfD, that would not have been possible. And that was, of course, an important chunk taken out of that firewall separating the AfD from the democratic parties. So increased salience and normalization go a long way in helping to explain what has happened in this last election, but it's not a story that started just before Christmas. You see here the average AfD support in German election or pre-election polls since the last election, since the 2021 election. Here, this is the first winter of energy scare when the Russians cut off Germany's gas supply and the federal government had to find ways to keep the heating going, basically. That was something that helped them quite a lot, but this remained more or less stable for most of 22 and early 23 until, of course, the campaign against the government. I think we really need to call this a campaign about the heating law kicked in when the Christian Democrats, but also a large part of the mainstream media and the Liberal Democrats aimed at the Greens in particularly and unleashed a proper culture war. And that really helped to bring up AfD support into the low 20s for the first time around about a year ago. What happened then was the scandal about their meeting with the identitarians, but also the emergence of the Sarah Wagenknecht alliance, which for a time seemed able to pull away voters from the AfD, people who were unhappy with the government, didn't like the Christian Democrats, were offered an alternative, and that really reduced AfD support in the polls for a time, but then they bounced back, notwithstanding all their scandals with not just one, but two candidates spying for Russia and the Chinese. And from then on, it was a steady climb back towards the 20s, low 20s here, the onset of the campaign and the final events during the campaign. So where do we go from here? What can we learn from this story? Well, starting with political science, I think it's fair to say that roughly 50% of AfD voters have consistently voted for the party, identify with the party, are strongly tied to the party in terms of their ideology. What we do not know yet as political scientists is whether the other half is different from those core voters or already similarly locked in, which seems plausible because this was a process that played out over 2 or 3 years. So maybe they're not that different at all. That is something that we will look into once the academic surveys come in. A second, more political question is, can we as scientists and citizens, can we do something about the erosion of this norm of inclusion, the so-called firewall? Can we convince mainstream politicians not to try to compete with the AfD on their field and on their issues? And can we encourage them to talk about their own agenda, about their own issues? Right now, everyone is terrified and running scared, with the exception of the left party probably, but everyone else tries to a degree to copy the AfD and to win back their voters. And from previous experience, that seems very much unlikely. Final question, one for the Q&A perhaps. How can a liberal democracy, how can liberal democratic institutions deal with this huge group of MPs which are by and large illiberal, and some of them even right-wing extremists, and who will try to abuse the system to the furthest possible extent? Thank you. That's it from my end.
Dr. Arzheimer, thank you very much. We will immediately continue with our third speaker. She is Dr. Anna Alarian. She's a professor of political science at the University of Florida. And her research focuses, among others, of course, on far-right politics in Europe and the United States. So her topic today is Accommodation or Exclusion, Immigration, the AfD, and Democratic Challenges in the 2025 election. Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of Florida. And today I'll focus my remarks building on what we've already heard on 3 big questions. What happened? How did we get here? This moment of far-right ascension, and suggesting what lies ahead, what goes next. Throughout this discussion, I'm going to be focusing on the 2025 election. Obviously, that's the point of this panel and discussion today, but we'll also be looking backwards to 2021 and 2017 to help us understand the challenges for democracy, and focusing primarily on the main issue for AfD, their prized issue, immigration. I'm also going to be presenting some published and ongoing work, and you can find all of that on my website and more if you're interested. So as we've heard from our first 2 speakers, and likely the reason you're here today is to understand this seismic political shift in the February election. As we heard, the AfD secured 20.8% in the second vote, this national party list, and 20.6% in the first or candidate votes, sweeping the former East German states. As a result, the party is the second largest in parliament currently. And this rise is meteoric. It's the party's 4th federal election and the first time running a chancellor candidate. So how did we get here? The success, as we heard, comes after a slight dip in the last election, which at the time many of us considered a significant loss for the party. This is important, this doubling, as we heard, but so is the spread of the party in direct mandated seats in the first vote. AfD's first entry into parliament came with 3 direct mandated seats. The second expanded into new seats and new states by a factor of 5. And now we're at a point at which the party won more seats than it could even seat due to proportionality in the new electoral law. So winning 46, but only able to seat 42. So how did we get here? A successful far-right party was long thought to be impossible in post-war Germany. And now we have one as the largest opposition party in parliament. So let's first consider the electorate, what we consider voter demand for far-right populism. And what I might argue is that this election result was not necessarily entirely surprising. Polling for the AfD, as we heard from Kai, has been on the rise the last 2 years and was roughly what we expected via opinion polling here. It's been fairly consistent. And so the die may have already been cast for this AfD's success in this election in the last election. So why? Let's time travel back to 2021 and take the most important issue for AfD support, which was immigration. And now here in this 2021 election, there was kind of an expectation, and we heard this slightly here with Kai's presentation, that immigration wasn't that salient, it wasn't that important. We were at a point at which we were experiencing this multiple crisis era of the COVID pandemic. We saw catastrophic flooding and increasing attention to climate change with the Fridays for Future movement. But nevertheless, there were clear signs that the main policy issue for the AfD, immigration, was still very much on the minds of the German electorate. So here, looking at the main issue of importance, here we saw that even though immigration salience in the media and in these crises decreased in the months preceding the 2021 election, the share of the German electorate who reported immigration as one of the most important issues facing Germany remained high. In total, approximately 1 in every 6 German survey respondents in the Glace reported migration as one of the key issues. This is about 17%. So we could think about 17 versus this 20.8%. It's not as surprising in the months preceding the 2021 election. So what this shows is that this persistent importance of immigration is a stable contingency of the electorate throughout the country that perceives immigration as an important issue to be dealt with. And this is not necessarily regionalized. The importance of this information, the importance of immigration is just as important in Saxony for voters as it was in North Rhine-Westphalia. There's no statistically significant differences across the country. But there is a difference in how people perceive immigration should be dealt with. As you can see, kind of mirroring this AfD performance stronger in the East, we see more favoring of immigration restrictions in the East as well. But again, this is not necessarily due to immigration salience, right? This is an important thing to continue to bring up here, that as we can see, just looking at the net migration, we could see that immigration importance was not correlated between how many people came to one state or not. And that, in fact, actually, when states experienced more decline, people moving outside of those states, actually people favored restricting immigration more. And this is in the 2021 election. Okay, there we go. So even when migration wasn't salient, it was driving opinions and support for the AfD. What does this mean for 2025? Again, we have multiple crises, this time not environmental and health, at least in salient media rhetoric, but instead we're looking at foreign policy, energy, the economy, and again, kind of migration. So we can see the energy climate in terms of what is the most important issue facing Germany and public opinion, declining over time, where immigration is increasing, as we saw previously. We can see this is even more than the Ukraine war and concerns about the AfD or right politics. The only issue as close to immigration and refugee and integration, we're collapsing these three together, is the economy. So what does this all mean? Well, we've got an electorate that is concerned about immigration, and this doesn't necessarily mean that they're negative, they're concerned. Where do they turn? voters will likely turn to the only party that is eager and excited to talk about immigration, and that's the AfD. So the AfD owns this issue, as evidenced by their 2021 party manifesto. Nearly 1 in every 12 sentences throughout the entire manifesto made a reference to immigration. Comparing that to the CDU, CSU, the main party on the right, that we see only 1 out of every 40 sentences in their platform. Moreover, in conversations, and as Eric referenced, when we talk to people on the ground ahead of this election, parties and party members express this real reticence and concern about bringing up migration at all, lest they bring attention to the AfD. So this could result in this perception that mainstream parties, both on the left and on the right, have abandoned this issue of migration. So if you're an immigration concerned voter, you might be more likely to, again, to turn to the party who is addressing the issue, even if you disagree with these policy platforms. So in the 2025 campaign, the party didn't just simply focus on migration. They did address some of these other concerns that were brought up in the prior presentations and made an effort to diversify their topics, addressing these other top issues as evidenced in the public polling data. You can see energy and conflict, although the methods through which the AfD wants to push for peace are suspect at best. But the importance of immigration in these campaigns is not too far gone. So I'll show you the immigration campaigns, some examples of these campaigns from 2017, 2021, and 2025. 2017, this messaging is very clear for immigration. We don't want burqas, we want bikinis. This focus shifted away from using women's bodies, and I'm excited to hear Sabina speak on this later in our panel today, moving towards this more focus of returning to normal, but still protecting borders and migration is still very front and center of the campaign. In 2025, we see some new images kind of catching, let's say, the middle of these two frames, now kind of signaling, again, some cultural elements to this migration conversation. So it's not simply that the party speaks, the AfD speaks the most about immigration, this quantity, but it's also the content and focus that has varied over time. So using campaign manifesto data, a working paper, we look at the targets of the migration discussion and see that this party has shifted over time. In 2013, this migration discussion was really broad. It was really just these vague references to migration, or if we did have any kind of specific element of migration in this campaign, it was about refugees. This shifted over time in 2017 and in 2021 to a more specific form of immigration discussion. Now the party is mainly considering migration through the lens of refugees, but also highlighting specific immigrant origins, religious affiliations, really simply Muslim, and legality or say irregular migration. But I want to be very clear that regardless of this diversity of migration discussion in the manifestos, this tone is nearly universally negative and vitriolic. So that brings to my second question, or third question, I guess. What comes next? There's all this questions of the success, and that leads towards questions of democratic legitimacy and party and government strategy. Namely, do we accommodate or do we exclude? If we continue to exclude, we might see more of the same, and we might be excluding about a fifth of the voting population. If we accommodate, well, we might be handing the policy positioning role back to the AfD. So both of these strategies would appear to play into the hands to varying degrees of the AfD. One, a narrative of democratic legitimacy with exclusion, and the other, well, let's just provide the AfD access to the policymaking space. Now, we can kind of assess this in some capacity through, I think Kai brought this up a little bit, this scandal of some form of smaller accommodation strategy. I want to make it very clear that coalition talks are out of the question. The CDU has made this abundantly clear from before the election occurred to now. This is not within the realm of possibility. But in the lead up to the election, there was this vote which relied on AfD support on a symbolic migration, anti-migration measure. And this did seem to shake up politics, at least in Berlin, where we did see protests, and we did see these protests across the country against this, saying you are collaborating with the party, with the AfD, and now we, the people, will be the firewall. Well, this allows us to kind of assess, well, did this more symbolic form of accommodation work? Could this be a strategy moving forward to do smaller elements so that we can cripple the AfD in future elections or through governance? I assessed this with a co-author just on a survey experiment right between the scandal and right before the election occurred to see, well, when you're exposed, you're aware that this happened, this accommodation happened, will you be more satisfied with democracy? Will it change any attitudes or vote choice? And for all intents and purposes, the strategy did not work. The answer is no. Big takeaway, it did not change one's attitudes towards democracy. We're more satisfied if you know that, well, there's no longer this firewall potentially in smaller forms. Didn't change your attitudes towards immigration, who you'd vote for, even who you liked. So the big takeaway from this is any form of accommodation or collaboration has the potential to lose a lot, especially in political capital, with very little to gain, with nothing to gain, essentially, in this case. Yet to be fair, continued exclusion didn't really seem to do anything either, kind of using this as an additional test, where it showed participants, the firewall is very strong, they will be continued to exclude, sees nothing really moved here either. So the larger argument is that more than symbolic gestures might be needed. There's also this argument of adaptation. What if the center-right parties move to the right on this issue of migration to gain policy support? And we have great evidence from Tarek Abushadi and Rafaela Danziger saying, no, this also doesn't work. In some other work, kind of looking across Europe, we see even if parties start to talk like the AfD or the far right on migration broadly, they can't pull voters away from these parties. So what do? We've seen kind of versions of this figure before. We know voter turnout was the highest, it was historic, and most of these new voters came from previous non-voters. This could be an opportunity. It could mean that parties can focus on mobilizing these new voters. Again, we have yet to see whether they have been crystallized in the AfD base, but they could do so without competing on the far right's terms. So what do? What's the big takeaway here? AfD win was historic, and we shouldn't ignore the legacy of immigration concerns that is growing in its wake. So parties should address this issue of migration, not by endorsing policy or even accommodating policy. We know this doesn't work, but potentially by offering an alternative to the alternative without exiting the migration space entirely, while also simultaneously addressing the real socioeconomic and demographic concerns of these potential voters. With that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. We immediately go to the fourth presentation, which will be delivered by Dr. Conrad Ziller, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Duisburg-Essen. And Dr. Ziller works and focuses mainly on the role of immigration in politics and society, the radical right, and policy effects on citizens. The title of his talk tells us all: the AfD's surge in 2025 elections, patterns of realignment and political implications. Conrad, you have the floor.
Yes, thanks for having me. So today I'm going to talk about the old and new voter bases of the AfD. Who are these new voters and what motivates them? So most of what I want to say in the beginning has already been covered, but nevertheless, so we had highest turnout rate since reunification. The AfD reached its strongest results. They have quite a dominance in East Germany with close to 50% in some districts, but it also gained strength with many especially post-industrial districts of the West. So the question is, what are these people who gave their vote additionally to the AfD? Which role do changes to voter bases, realignment of voter bases play? And do the underlying motives to vote for AfD differ for these new groups of voters? Again, some descriptives here. On the left side, you see the level of vote shares for the AfD, and on the right side, you see like changes between the 2021 and 2025 election. We saw that the AfD vote share doubled, and it doubled in almost all cases. So if you look at districts, then you see that in districts where it performed like 5% in 2021, it now has 10. Where it has like 10%, it now has 20. Where it had 20, it has now 40%. It's close to 50% in some districts, especially in Saxony, and it has also some substantial gains in former SPD strongholds, for instance, in Duisburg, but also in Gelsenkirchen, where it gained about 24–25%. The other parties, if you look at how they changed, so especially the members of the traffic light coalition, they lost quite some votes, and CDU, CSU, and the left party, they also gained a couple of percentage points. All right, also we saw these graphs already. So where did voters come from? Most of them are previous non-voters. Second largest are from Conservative and the Liberal Party, and the third are from Social Democrats. And then what motivates people, we also heard about that, the salience of issues. So immigration and domestic security were like the front runners in terms of issues, followed by economic growth, international affairs, and rising prices. But these are like second tier. The first tier are immigration and domestic security. So now the question is, do we have here some surprising allies that voted for the AfD that didn't do before, and what might motivate them? So today I'm going to concentrate on three groups: so immigrant voters, then workers of color, and young men. For immigrant voters, we see, so this is like a projection from the Datesim panel shortly carried out after the election. So all voters, among all voters, the AfD had 20.8%. And for immigrant voters overall, it's 10.4%. And if we look at what was the result in the 2021 election, it's similar, that it about doubled. Then what also needs to be emphasized is that immigrants are not the same, of course. Groups differ quite tremendously. So we have here a projection from post-Soviet resettlers who were about 40.2% likely to vote for the AfD. And compared to 2021 result, we would also argue, or we could argue that it doubled.
You mean the Ziller? Conrad, the
Yes.
Ziller? Yes, okay. People coming from Soviet Union, the ex-Soviet Union, etc.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
But also, if you look at Poles or people from Italy, then we see also that they have a similar result, so that they have like quite high probability to vote for the AfD. If we look at workers of blue color, Kai Arzheimer already emphasized this, that among workers, the AfD performed quite well. So this is just aggregated for these two districts that are quite that had quite a high vote share for the AfD. So we see that about 11 to 13 percentage points a drop in SPD voting share, and about the same that the AfD gained. Of course, it's not automatic that from SPD they go to AfD, but still it should illustrate that there is something going on, and we should ask ourselves, what specific is this here? How specific is this? Is this about feeling left behind? Is this about infrastructure? What is this about? And similar for young men. So we see among the cohort of 18 to 24 years old that the AfD performed best among these young men, so with 27%, which is concerning and which is really something new compared to the last election. And here also the question is, what motivated them? If we look at explanations, of course, there are several explanations out there that could like relate these specific groups and also their motivations to vote AfD. I cannot do in this short time like a whole roundup here, but cultural backlash, lack of social recognition, nostalgic appeal of the far right, declining middle, and also structural transformations. This could be related also to this working class transformation of left parties, group identities, identity politics, and far more. So it's not monocausal, of course, but these are just to illustrate that. What I want to focus on today is just a selection of these explanatory frameworks. So first of all, there is like one broad explanatory framework, a classic one by Shahil from 2009, who explains why should people at lower social classes or who are marginalized, why would they vote for a nationalist and maybe also an anti-immigrant party if they would gain basically more from redistribution party? Because these nationalists and these anti-immigrant parties, they're typically quite liberal parties that are not like really concerned with the problems and with the economic status of people at the bottom. And his argument is that from this redistribution, the marginalized gain people would have is too low because they would still remain at the bottom of society. But if they turn to nationalist parties and if they get like let's say promises that immigrants are kicked out of the country, and similar promises which actually these parties made, then they would gain in terms of social identity much more because they would like move up the ladder quite more, and this would, so to say, serve their social identity even more compared to a little bit of redistribution. Then we have some explanatory models or arguments that say, okay, it might be about social belonging, and also others point to the role of social isolation, loneliness, and also depression. Here we could argue that this might be something which is quite strongly related to young men who suffered also during the pandemic. Maybe this would be an explanatory approach here. Then a paper I also co-authored, we looked at progressive policies and argued that populist radical right parties, they need these progressive policies to use them as a vehicle. And then they might be able to particularly reach people who have the feeling that they lose out if progressive policies gets implemented. So environmental protection, gender equality, and also immigration and integration. What we find in this article is that it's not so much that specific segments of society, they get attracted if the combination of populist parties and progressive policies are there, but that this is more a universal pattern that different segments of the society have or develop similarly when these developments happen. And then another paper or another approach would be to say, okay, this left behind, especially living in left behind places, this could contribute to feelings of deprivation, and then in the end motivate people to vote radical right, to emphasize, to highlight their frustration and their discontent with established politics. How do I do this empirically? So there I will present some empirical insights. It's from a web survey that was fielded during the election, a couple of days before and a couple of days after. The number of respondents is about 2,500. Bellendi carried out the survey, and it's stratified for age, gender, education, and region to, at least for these characteristics, closely match the German population. So what we asked is, which party do you generally lean towards? So not which party you would vote for or voted for, but which party you lean towards or identify, so to say. And what we see here is that this closely resembles what also happened in the election. So CDU-CSU, a bit more than 25, about 25%, then SPD 19%, Greens 13%, FDP and BSV single digits, Die Linke similar to what they had, and also AfD 21%, which is quite close to what we saw in the election. If we look at how many people or how many respondents are there? It's about 450 people who said that they lean towards the AfD in this survey. So if we look then at some of these explanatory factors that could determine AfD vote, I clustered them to social integration, where I have a measure of satisfaction with neighborhood and social trust. Then threat perceptions, that is that you don't want to have a Muslim as a neighbor. And then the item that traditions are specifically important compared to progress in society. And then also two indicators of the feeling of being left behind. I mean, East German, it's not really, it's an aggregated indicator that is not like really left behind, but still it runs under the same heading. But what I will focus on is the share of old people in the district, because this is something which indicates to what extent young people moved away and left behind basically those who are still there, old people and people of low education typically. A couple of control variables too. And so just to be clear, these left behind indicators, they are macro level indicators that I added to the survey because it's geocoded. So what we see here, and all these continuous variables are standardized so that we also could compare here the effect size. What we see is that social trust, so people who say they don't trust other people, they or if they trust other people, then they are less likely to vote for the AfD. If people don't want Muslim as neighbors and think that traditions are important, then they also are more likely to vote for the AfD. And then people who live in left behind regions, they're also more likely to vote for AfD. So this is like the main pattern across all groups, across the whole sample. So now I look into these specific groups. So if we look at immigrant voters, we see that the social integration measures are not that important here, but that we see that also the threat perceptions, including not wanting Muslims as neighbors, that these are significant predictors of AfD vote. And unemployment here is also something that turned out to be really important. So if immigrants are not integrated in the labor market, they are more likely to say that they lean towards AfD. If we look at workers blue collar, this is like unemployed and people who are marginally employed. So because I don't have like original information on occupation here in this survey, but if we look at them, then we see that also here this threat perception is very important and gives like a high coefficient estimate. Also the share of old people in the district, so this left behind indicator. And if we look at young men, it's a similar story basically, because also we see here that threat perception, and Islamophobia, and also the feeling, or not the feeling, but living in a left behind place is also relevant here. So in the end, what we see here is that the pattern in terms of motivation are strikingly similar across these groups, where we could argue they might be motivated by different underlying mechanisms. So to conclude this, the new voter bases, they differ little in terms of motives from the traditional AfD voters, where we know that especially the feeling of being left behind, but also this cultural threat and anti-immigration stances, that they are most important driving factors. Anti-immigration as a topic, as an issue, worked well for the AfD with little and no counter strategies from mainstream parties. We heard about this before also, but it's mirrored in the individual level mechanisms, where we see that, for instance, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant stances, anti-progressiveness stances, that they can also even reach people who themselves has an immigration background. And an investment in left behind places, because we also saw that this is like an important factor still here, also for these for voters in general, but also these new segments of voters. An investment in left behind places may serve as a strategy to regain trust from disenchanted voters. We see that the CDU-CSU and also the SPD, they today debate this in the parliament. Their plans for a special money to invest in infrastructure. But the question that really remains is, can we unring the bell once these hidden preferences are unlocked? Because this is like also a main driver, or seen as a main driver, that it's not so much that AfD really developed these preferences in the electorates, but that these preferences might be already there, but the AfD only shifts the norms so that people are bold enough to cast their vote for the AfD. And this is another concept that has got some attention, this need for chaos, where people really think that, wait a second, maybe if really this democracy comes to an end and the populists or authoritarians are able to install a new system, maybe I get a new place in the system where I can enrich myself. So this need for chaos concept that might be a preferences we haven't looked at so much at the moment, but what also I and co-authors do increasingly, this is something we should think about, and also think about what we can do to counteract this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Conrad. The fifth and last presentation will be delivered by Dr. Sabine Volk, who is a postdoctoral fellow researcher at the University of Passau, and her research interests include populism and the far right, party politics and social movements in Germany and Europe. So her talk's title is Germany's Far Right, Anti-Feminism Sells. Sabine, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. You can hear me now, right? Yes.
Yep.
Can you see my presentation well? Yeah.
Also, good.
Because I'm having a strange way. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be part of the panel. Of course, I guess we all want to start debating already, and so maybe I will try to be a bit short so that we get to talk about with each other. Yeah. So my short talk will touch upon some issues that have already been raised, namely the issues of AfD, what drives AfD, and especially this notion of gender. And usually when we start talking about populist far-right parties and gender, people wonder why even talk about the gender issue. These parties are anti-immigration parties. Conrad just showed, and Hannah before him as well, that it was really the issue of immigration driving this election campaign, and immigration is still the issue that AfD really capitalizes upon. Yeah, and yet looking into what AfD says in its manifestos and what AfD says on social media, and also looking back into the very beginnings of AfD, we see that this notion of gender was important from the very beginning, even though AfD started out as this anti-immigration and Eurosceptic actor, right? So my argument overall is that gender issues related to gender equality, gender diversity are getting much more prominent within AfD's political agenda. And they are actually also a factor, I would argue, that AfD is overall getting more voters, more traction, and trying, yeah, to diversify its political portfolio. And here on the slide, I just showed to illustrate this claim that gender has been important from the very beginning. I show this Facebook post, yeah, from 2013, and who would have thought AfD was already claiming, and back then really an anti-EU, anti-Euro actor, and they were already claiming, stop the gender madness, simple truth, men and women are different. And to some extent, we can actually say that the tone has not changed so much since then. So as party scholars, when we look at gender and the far right, we can take somewhat two different axes, right? We can look at actors and we can look at ideologies. My focus later will be on idea and meaning making about gender, but very quickly to say something about gender, and this is what Kai already mentioned, this gender gap in AfD voting, right? So this is in that sense the 6%, so it's Still considerable gender gap also now in these elections, yet as Kai also mentioned, it is getting smaller, and still this really makes AfD also a somewhat typical populist radical right or far right party in the European context, where this gender gap is characteristic. Yeah. So in that way, AfD remains what Mutter once called a immense party, right? Mostly voted by men, but the amount of women voting AfD is ever increasing as well. And the key explanatory factor of why women also vote for AfD is not really so much related to AfD's politics of gender. Why would they be? It's actually also related to AfD's politics on immigration. Another way to look at this so-called gender gap in the far right is, of course, to look at actors themselves. And here we see this even more pronounced. Yeah. AfD claims to have around 19% of female members, so supporters. And then somewhat the higher we get up in this party hierarchy, women tend to be less and less represented. That is, of course, a typical phenomenon among parties, all parties that we have, yeah, that less women are active and less women are in leading positions. But in AfD, this phenomenon is particularly strongly pronounced. So in this new huge mega delegation that AfD will be sending to the German Bundestag, so around 150 people, we find only around 11.8% of women. So this will also really importantly impact the representation of women in the Bundestag overall. Yeah, the new Bundestag is going to be less diverse and more male dominated. And yet AfD, and this is also part of what makes that party interesting in some way, it is ambivalent when it comes to gender and even when it comes to this gender gap, since of course it's a main public face that has been so much internationally now known through her interactions with Elon Musk in particular, is Alice Weidel. So she is for some years already the co-chair. She is more visible, I would argue, much more visible than her than the other co-chair, Tino Kruppalla. And she is somewhat an interesting figure in that whole debate, gender equality, gender and sexual diversity, because she lives in a homosexual family, right? So it already seems that AfD, even though so male dominated, has some interesting positions for women to take. What I would argue, what now AfD actually thinks about issues of gender equality and also sexual diversity is what we see as what we can conceptualize as an anti-feminism that is partially modernized. So AfD will not claim for women to stay at home and only be mothers and housewives, and yet it is pronounced. Anti-feminism here defined as this, it's a reactionary ideological movement that really reacts to processes of emancipation, that wants to counter these processes of emancipation, that wants to maintain heteronormative power relations. And what characterizes AfD, very similar to its European brethren as well, is this ideology of so-called anti-genderism, so what scholars call the contemporary wave of anti-feminism. Anti-genderism is, of course, a very it's a difficult concept because it takes kind of far-right language and makes it into a scholarly concept. So I would treat it with some care. Yet this is the common denominator for these far-right campaigns against gender that doesn't root in far-right party politics, but that comes from, broadly speaking, civil society organizations, mostly organized in Christian and Christian fundamentalist circles as well. And yeah, my point would be that while AfD did not have as many links in the beginning, this is now becoming more and more pronounced. And to just illustrate what the key anti-feminist messages in AfD's broader ideological framework are, I'm listing 3 key points, and Hannah will see that one is missing, and I will say something about it after presenting the slide. So I have done brought a lot of manifesto analysis from over many years of AfD manifesto writing, and also from different levels of the polity, so federal manifestos, regional manifestos, and European manifestos. And what seems to be very clear that, first of all, that this whole gender topic is really important to AfD, yeah, much more so than it is to other European parties. If you look at Rassemblement National, yeah, Marine Le Pen will never write as much about the family and how important it is. Yet this is really a huge topic in AfD, especially on regional level, but also on the national level. And so this, the core focus is always on family. So we can call this like a familialist ideology, right? And in AfD's ideological profile, a family is defined as a heterosexual family. And this is even in the new manifesto from this year, yeah, saying that, yeah, the family, that's father, mother, and children. Why I say this is interesting is because Alice Weidel, so a homosexual mother of 2 children, she actually wanted that to be, this sentence that I put here on the slide, to be excluded from the manifesto. Her slogan is that a family is where children are. Yet she was outvoted by female party members from Saxony. That already points a bit, of course, also in this regional diversity of AfD, right? With somewhat more extreme factions being located in Eastern Germany. The second important element then of this AfD's meaning making around gender sexuality is what in international scholarship we now call trans panic. So very strong anti-diversity stances. Yeah, so the overall the rejection of trans people, trans rights, as well as gender diverse people's rights. And I'm illustrating this here also with an AfD campaign also from Saxony from a bit more than a year ago that created these I will not go into detail. This type of meaning making, of course, painting trans people as a threat to children. And then finally, the third tenet of this AfD's anti-feminism is the mobilization of masculinity, prominently so by key politicians such as Maximilian Krah, who failed somewhat in the European election campaign and is now actually going to the Bundestag without any problem. He has this very famous TikTok account where he sometimes gives dating tips, claiming that, oh, real men are right-wing, they have ideals, they are patriots, and then if you are right-wing, you will work. You will have a girlfriend. So these 3 tenets, what is missing from this list of AfD's anti-feminism, according to my own analyses, is this issue of female nationalism that Hannah illustrated. So this mobilization of women's rights as part of an anti-Islamic agenda, which I would argue has decreased in this particular election campaign in 2024-2025. It has not been part of any party manifesto, and it has also not featured as prominently on mobilization posters. And now, just to briefly end, why is AfD taking up this issue of anti-feminism alongside the anti-immigration stance? I see this as a mainstreaming strategy, most of all, that has two tenets. Yeah, first of all, this anti-feminist stance allows AfD to build alliances with other actors, yeah, with mainstream conservative, center-right, Christian democratic actors, for example, when adopting motions against gender language. For example, here in Bavaria, we have a gender language ban at university, right, that has actually been instituted by the Christian Social Union and not by AFD. So this is a really good tool to build these bridges to other actors. Also here in Bavaria, we saw this AFD's very first anti-gender, anti-trans demonstration, and I'm also posting here the poster on the slide. In Munich in 2023, again an event where AFD could easily network then with more parties from the mainstream and position itself as a somewhat more mainstream actor as well. And then the second part of that strategy, I'd say, is that anti-feminism simply appeals to anti-feminist attitudes that are widespread in the German population. Of course, mobilizing them as strongly as AFD does also will play into these attitudes and strengthen them. Yeah, but overall we find with somewhat higher levels, as you see on the slide, in East Germany. But overall, you find in the country quite high percentages of people with anti-feminist, sexist attitudes, and especially with transphobic attitudes. So this seems to really play into AFD's agenda. So this is all I wanted to say. A key takeaway, of course, that yes, gender is of particular importance. I do think it will be more important in the upcoming years. Also often in combination with other issues, like we have seen the combination of this anti-gender and anti-immigration issue. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sabine. And before opening the floor for the questions, I will abuse of my status of chair and moderator and come with one question to actually all panelists. And, you know, we have been successful, I think, in deconstructing AFD, and I'm sure the scholarly work will continue. I'm trying to reflect upon one particular point, which is not specific to East Germany, but almost all former Soviet satellite countries. You know, we mentioned the AFD's radicalism, and particularly why this radicalism appeals to the voters, and particularly in the eastern part of the country. Well, I mean, we heard from you the three important, you know, radical attitude. They are very comfortable with the extreme right narratives. They are openly xenophobic, and they are happy with it. And finally, they have a pronounced pro-Russian tropism. So my question is that, I mean, this, sociologically speaking, what about the lack of Holocaust education in all this? What about the memory works? Of course, the country is one since 30 years. I'm sure in the curricula there is Holocaust education in East German schools as well. But I mean, maybe it's not enough. I don't know. I mean, it's this is a question to you. And also, similarly, reckoning with the Stalinist past of East Germany. I mean, has this work been done properly, or it's underway? And has it any bearing on the voter attitude towards a party which you know, happily and openly you know, is proud of all these ills that we are trying to grasp and understand? Eric, I understand you are the please go ahead.
Well, I mean, you bring up memory politics. That's my kind of like bread and butter. And I mean, suffice it to say that, maybe I have some complex thoughts on the whole thing. I think it's interesting that the implication of your question is that there's not enough kind of memory work or not enough, Holocaust education. And I think maybe that's not the right way to think about it. Maybe we need to think about how to make Holocaust education and memory work more effective in the current kind of environment, right? And I actually think that a lot of the mainstream institutional actors have perhaps erred in kind of doubling down on this kind of stuff, right? And then this also plays into, Germany has this whole system of anti-Semitism commissioners now at the state level. And suffice it to say that there have been some controversies with their kind of efforts, that maybe they've overshot when it came to, shutting down pro-Palestinian protests last year and stuff like that. So I actually think that German memory culture is kind of stagnant in this day and age, and it's time to kind of renew it instead of doubling down on what I don't think has been working. It's also true that Holocaust memory does not resonate as much in the East compared to the West. And so that is definitely a consideration. One of the other things is I'm not sure that Holocaust memory resonates as much with Germans with a migration background, which is what, 27% of the population. So I don't know. I really do think it's time to think a little bit more differently, and also not to think that Germany's internationally renowned culture of contrition is going to be the salve and is going to kind of solve a lot of these problems. So I guess those would be my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Eric. Unless other panelists would react to it, Kai?
I don't think I have much to add to that, but I think it's interesting to flip the question around and see that the AfD attacks memory politics at every possible opportunity. So they seem to perceive that as a threat to what they stand for and a threat to their vision of Germany. Just a thought from my end.
Thank you. Let's continue with the questions. Bülent?
Yeah, thank you, Cengiz. Thank you very much for these insightful and thought-provoking presentations. My question is directed to the whole panel. Whoever want to answer, he or she can. The primary driver of the AfD's success is undeniably the issue of immigration and the concerns surrounding it. When we discuss immigrants in Germany, we are referring to millions of people who are directly affected by these political shifts and rhetorics. As political agents and stakeholders in society, what role should immigrants themselves play in response to these developments? What strategies or actions would you recommend for immigrant communities to effectively challenge the rise of exclusionary policies, racism, and anti-immigrant sentiments? Thank you.
Who would go for it?
I think I can say something about that. So I think there are also like different layers to that. I mean, immigrants are not the same, that's for sure. And you have some immigrants that are much more prone to vote for the AfD than others. And you have immigrants who would be much more affected by electoral win or even a government of the AfD. So in the end, for instance, the Turkish community, they are much less likely to vote for the AfD. But on the other hand, you have nationalists, Turkish nationalists, that are directly addressed also by social media from AfD and AfD proponents. They try to capitalize on the anti-elitist narrative much more than anti-immigrant narrative to make themselves also more popular amongst these groups. And in terms of preparation, it's difficult to say, because I mean, we can look to the US basically now and see in real time what would happen if like populist radical right party takes power. And similar in Germany, I think. I mean, it's not that it's from today to tomorrow that deportations happen and so on. But I mean, it would be a real threat. And then I think even the AfD, they discussed about revoking citizenship that you acquired along the way, stuff like that. So it's really frightening. But I think we don't have a good answer yet how to counteract that.
Any more reaction from the panelists? Sabine?
Yes, just briefly. So from a social movement background or theory framework speaking, all good revolutions or revolts are done by alliance building, right? So different groups within the population have to ally together against something like a common enemy, right? So if you want to put it into like Claudian terms, like you have to integrate these different demands, and I guess this is really the key, yeah. And maybe these demonstrations against right-wing extremism, as some people called them, or for democracy, that started last year after the publication of this corrective report, when to many people it came as a surprise that AfD demands remigration. But they were a starting point. They were overall in many cities really dominated by young students, white Germans in that sense, right? But this could be a starting point also to ally then with immigrant organizations, I think. And then we would need some elite allies to make that movement more effective. That could be found in certain parties. I mean, Greens come to mind, the left comes to mind, and yeah.
There is a question by one of the participants, Laurie Moulton. Laurie, if you are still there with us, could you repeat your questions, because you had 3 of them, and it would be better that way instead of me reading them. Are you there, Laurie?
Yes, I am there, and actually, I
Good.
just
Please go
typed
ahead.
another one. I mean, do any of the speakers not see AfD as primarily a anti-system protest vote, just as Trump, I think, is, you know, against the status quo? The system is broken. It no longer has legitimacy. Instead of, focusing so much on party lines. I think the issue is much deeper. I think there's a deeper social issue that has to be addressed and faced. I guess that's the core of my question. I mean, immigration is used as a talking point, but actually the issue is people do not feel happy with their lives, and they look for excuses and scapegoats. And instead of addressing the causes why people are upset, be it unemployment or housing or whatever, or just the feeling that they're disadvantaged, you know, it's easier for both left and right to bat the immigration ball. But I mean, those 2 questions about, you know, what's driving the AfD fundamentally, I'd be interested in the speaker's thoughts.
Okay, who would go for it? Kai?
Yeah, thank you for the question. First, I think you're right. There are more fundamental causes that are driving xenophobia and unhappiness and protest and whatever you want to call it. And Germany would be a better place if politicians would go on and address these root causes, if you wish. Having said that, it's quite clear that most AfD voters are quite ideological. So yes, they are unhappy. Yes, they want to send a protest message. But you would be hard-pressed to find any AfD voters which are not totally opposed to immigration and to immigrants, and specifically to Muslims. So that is really a core element of the AfD's support. So I'm not quite sure that by removing policy problems that would simply go away. And finally, you're mentioning Trump and the fact that people have massive doubts about the system. Many AfD voters would agree. Germany is going to the dogs. The whole country is run down. Institutions cannot be trusted. The interesting thing is that we know from panel studies where we poll people again and again and again, and that the causality seems to work the other way around. So you become an AfD voter, and then you start to becoming less trustful and more unhappy over time. Presumably because you move into a bubble and you follow the party line, which is super negative on just about anything.
Lauri, satisfied?
Yeah, I mean, I think he does hit a couple of points.
Good. Stanislas has questions. Stanislas, you have the floor.
Yes, greetings. Thank you for the very insightful panel. Being Polish, I was trying to perhaps draw some links to the rise of the Confederation Party we've seen in my country, with a lot of similar issue positions with AfD and FPO as well. Now, my questions are, I'll just kind of read them out if you don't mind. Based on your knowledge of the German political scene, do you think that by focusing on immigration in this way, where we have center-right parties trying to basically increasing the political salience of immigration in order not to seem inactive on the issue when populist radical right parties very much have that perception? Do you think that there is basically a link between the decline of conservative center-right parties and the decline in the quality of overall democratic governance in Western and Central European states, that happens by the way of normalizing the radical rights by adopting their immigration stances, as Matt tried to do with just before the election as well? Thank you.
Okay, Conrad?
I mean, there is literature on that. What also Kai had on his last slide. Don't try to outsmart the AfD. Don't use those positions for your own, because voters recognize this and go back to, let's say, the original or the issue owner. And I think this is also what we saw here. I mean, the CDU-CSU really try to gain voters by putting in making the Bundestag vote about their resolution about being more tough on the borders. And I think it's what we see, but again, there is like some double bite here, because I think it's also, it's not a solution for the CDU-CSU to say, okay, we adopt the green and left stance on this and be pro-immigrant. I mean, so it's really problematic if you really try to out-toughen the AfD. I don't think it works, but by not addressing the topic at all, it also does not work. So one has to come up here really clever and also address social norms and salience and say, okay, how often or do we really have a problem, an immigration problem here? How does it really look like? I mean, we in science, we do this all the time, that we compare, okay, what is empirical reality and what is like public discourse? And I think CDU-CSU, they also know what the reality is, and that we didn't have like a real emergency situation, but that this was basically made up also a bit in discourse. And I think it would be more honest, and it would regain maybe even more votes if they were like a bit more sophisticated about this and not trying to out-toughen the AfD. So basically it was like the CDU was like adopting all these issues that the AfD had 3 months before. So this is basically how this process looked like. And that it didn't work, I think everyone knows, but clever solutions, they are not here yet, and we all have to think about them.
Hanna, you want to add something?
Yeah, I agree with everything Conrad said. I mean, essentially, you could think of, why would you vote for a party with the same platform rather than just the original party? And so when the party on the right adopts the same platform, there's they really only have things to lose, mainly their base, who would not have wanted to vote for the AfD, and now they're endorsing a party that's similar to this. But it's not just the parties on the right. The parties on the left also are not adding anything to this discourse really on immigration and providing kind of an alternative. We saw this with the Greens offering a migration platform or position, but kind of relatively late. In some conversations right before the election with some of these party elites, the AfD said essentially what I said, like, the CDU can act like us. It doesn't matter. They're going to vote for us anyway. And the Greens said, well, maybe we did this too late. So by not providing any alternative, it's a real difficult issue. Now, it's not a simple issue for any of the parties, because if this was the case, then we wouldn't see far-right populism increasing electorally across the continent. There isn't an easy solution for this. But we do see just treating immigration as an issue when it is salient is also not really the right path forward, because migration is an issue that is on voters' minds, migrants and non-migrant voters, regardless of when we have a quote-unquote crisis or a manufactured crisis.
Thank you, Anna. Selçuk Gültaşlı.
Thank you very much, Professor Aktar. Thank you very much for these wonderful presentations. A very interesting piece is published today at New York Times with the title, "An Unexpected Trump Bump for the World Centrists." It argues that Trump has galvanized support for moderate leaders and unified Europe rather than empowering far right. And a professor from Oxford in the same piece is saying Europe may have passed its moment of peak populism. My quick question is, do you agree with these assessments?
Actually, Selçuk, I will follow up on that, because I had a similar question to the panelists, and now with economically speaking, we will be seeing a Keynesian boom with the defense expenditures, as you all know, and there will be more job, more money in Europe for decades probably. One, two. The pro-Russian tropism of all these, extreme right populist parties will have no reason to exist anymore, because Russia is presented and, has risen again to the old Cold War position of the biggest threat. So within this framework, frankly, I don't see any bright future for these populist parties. Who would take the Eric?
I think that's a very intriguing hypothesis, that maybe we have reached or beyond the peak of populism. I don't know about that. I mean, I don't think that issues of immigration, multiculturalism, integration are going to go away anytime soon. Right. And I mean, most European societies, at least Western European societies, are becoming more diverse, whether it's more slowly, whether it's more quickly. So I think there might be a perennial appeal for such parties. In the German context, I was really following the discussion that we had earlier. Maybe it was Conrad, I can't remember who did that, about, well, how do you respond, right? Do you accommodate? Do you continue to have the firewall? I think that will be the most important factor kind of going forward. And, if I can bring it back to memory politics one more time, I mean, I'm always going to bring it back to memory politics, right? I mean, I sometimes wonder, maybe one of the other problematic aspects of memory culture right now is that Germans only take one lesson from the past, right? Which is, you can't give them any space, because otherwise it's going to be 1933 all over again. I mean, maybe it's time for Germans to think about, other historical parallels where, sometimes when you engage them, they actually do defang and de-radicalize. So I don't know. I think that what's necessary in going forward is, a bigger discussion, right? Not just to create an alternative to the alternative, as one of my colleagues put it, right? But what the long-term strategy should be.
Yeah. I mean, I should add also that this Keynesian boom, economic boom that is coming, would require more manpower. And manpower means immigration. I mean, all these migrants that we are, finger pointing at in every country in Western Europe, particularly, well, I mean, they will be needed. And they are already needed anyhow, but they will be even needed more in the decades to come. So less meat for the extreme right populists. So who has Laurie? You are writing something, but please come.
No, it's another somewhat different topic, and it goes back to this issue of political parties and it's not. We need, I think, to save or improve democracy, we need a more engaged inclusive citizenry, not on political party lines, because that's just, fighting civil war. And expecting that elected party politicians will save, the day, I think is foolhardy. And so I'm a strong proponent of, getting more meaningful citizens engagement, deliberative democracy that can be used with parties, because I see that that is the only way of getting out of the dead ends we're driving ourselves into, and that's how I think you address AfD and the populist parties, by being open, inclusive, and finding some common way forward. And your immigration, I don't dispute. Yes, we need immigrants, but if the people in the country do not accept them and want them, that's beside the point. I think we have to get more to the emotions of people and where people are, and not, theories or ideologies. Anyhow, I'll leave it there. And I did recommend a couple of highly recommended books in my Dan von Raybrook Against Elections, and John Alexander Citizens are highly worth reading.
Excellent. Eric, yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to bring something else up that we've only tangentially discussed right now, which is the information environment. I mean, we did talk about how the crisis of immigration is largely manufactured. I think Sabina mentioned Maximilian Krah's TikTok and stuff like that, right? But this is increasingly a problem, not just in Germany, but across the world, certainly in the United States, that there's propaganda and misinformation all over the internet. And for whatever reason, the right populist parties seem to be just masterful at being able to, use social media and all these new technologies and things like that. So, I mean, I guess the point that I would make is, I'd be interested in some of my colleagues' responses. Why are the mainstream parties so poor with this kind of communication and social media? And, what can be done to, I guess, chip away at the advantage that right-wing populists have? And one other point to that, one of the reasons that the left party did so well was precisely a very kind of like masterful social media campaign with a younger face and everything like that. So here we have the far left and the far right, using these technologies masterfully, but the mainstream parties can't. So I don't know, any thoughts on that?
Any thoughts on that, Kai?
Just a thought. First, you're right. The AfD is dominating social media in Germany, at least as far as Twitter is concerned. It's a bit different on other platforms, but they have become the most important actor on Twitter. Jasmin Riedel at Munich does some sterling work in monitoring German social media, and they had a dashboard during the electoral campaign where you could see sentiment towards German parties, and the AfD was always on top at Twitter. And that's not normal. That's not because they're so masterful. It's because the algorithm has been changed to favor their issues and even their accounts. It's quite obvious. And this is not something that happened when Elon Musk intervened in the election. This is something that goes back around about 2 years when he took over and began to transform Twitter. My second point, you've already mentioned the left. Yes, they know how to play that game. Heidi Reicheneck is a hero for many young internet users in Germany, but the Greens are also not too bad on social media. So I think this is more about the Christian Democrats, who are by and large perhaps too old or too ideologically removed from parts of the internet to be good at this game. Just my very unscientific take on that.
Thank you. Thank you. If there is no one or two final questions, is there any? I saw one yellow hand, but it disappeared. It's gone. Are you still there? Okay. It's 5 to whatever, 5 to the hour, depending where you are. And well, it was, I think, useful and not just talks, but also interactions. Thank you to all on behalf of the European Center for Populism Studies. My understanding is that there is a question here. Neo Citole. Okay, please go ahead.
It wasn't really a question. I was congratulating the panelists, but I do have one in mind. Unfortunately, it doesn't have much to do about the presentation, but I am curious what the new post-election political setup in Germany means for European politics, and what the increase in AfD votes means for European democracy overall. So whoever feels that they can tackle that, I'll be more than happy to listen.
Implications on what?
On European politics overall.
Sure, of course. Who would go for it? Anna, you are working also on Europe. Sabine.
Yeah, I will say, but only a few words, because of course European politics so broad, right? We need to differentiate a bit which area. I guess like one area that I would be interested in, and that I think there will be a positive impact, will be politics on Ukraine, right? I guess Germany will take a more decisive position on aiding Ukraine with the Chancellor Merz than it has been doing with the Chancellor Scholz. And I mean, who knows if there will be some more close collaboration with Macron, with Tusk from Poland, in a direction of more European defense, more spending on this, more willingness to engage more actively, right? Also, of course, under the impression of what is happening in the US.
Thank you. Okay, the yellow hand came back. James Fahey, you have the floor.
Hi, sorry. It took me far too long to figure out how to raise my hand on Zoom again after I put it down. So apologies for that. I just had two very short things. What I wanted to say about the misinformation that Eric sort of mentioned, and I think agreeing with Kai as well, that you have algorithm manipulation. I think also this sort of ties to what Hannah has been talking about when it comes to how these parties are constrained in what they can and can't say. And I sometimes get a little frustrated that the far right or far left are seen as these incredible manipulators of social media when they're just not constrained by norms of traditional party behavior. In this case, they can just lie a lot, and lying gets engagement. And so sometimes I think that's a pretty easy explanation of why these parties dominate, why Trump dominates, is just they're not constrained and they do things that are fun. One question that I had, that it was sort of to Conrad's question, Conrad's presentation, who mentioned that one kind of bulwark against the continued development of the AfD would be to invest in Eastern European or Eastern German regions that feel sort of left behind, to increase infrastructure. And it's sort of tied to this question of as well, I think Lori mentioned that people who are unemployed, that we need to solve these sort of basic economic issues. And my question is to what degree is that just sort of lip service? Because these seem like kind of fundamental questions of of post-industrial democracies that I heard a lot of party members say this, we just have to get back to bread and butter issues. We have to solve these things. But what does that literally look like? I mean, Germany is an economy of 86 million people with a huge number of problems. Like, is this just something we say because it seems like it's a good possible solution moving forward? Or are there kind of easy wins that we can get here that might actually drive the supply down? I know that there's like 1 minute, so I wouldn't hold anyone to actually answer this, but I figured since I figured out how to raise my hand, I would.
Who would react?
Maybe just briefly about that. I think it's different layers here. I think the emotional thing that also others mentioned, that it's important to get more emotions into politics. Basically, that's like the driving vehicle we see, and this is like something that also promises some success as seen by the left party and so on. And on the other hand, you have all these complex things to solve and also to claim ownership for that and also claim responsibility for the things for the good things politics did. And I think this should be like, or this might be a promising strategy, that you do good things and talk about this more, maybe even in a more populist and emotionalized way, but at least do not leave the stage for all this negativity, deflecting, and making people anxious and insecure about things. This is what populist radical right parties do, and maybe we see at some point that mainstream parties are able to do the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Who else would react? Otherwise, I will close the session. And we have an expression in Turkish. We say, when you cook rice, when there is not enough water, we say this rice might absorb more water, which means that I apply this to AfD, and I'm sure that this issue will make us talk and search and reflect for many more years. Thank you all. Thank you on behalf of the ECPS, and see you all at the next panel of the ECPS. Thank you.